Well, you're watching Press TV's news review, where we look deeper into some of the top stories of the day. On this segment of the program, Ukraine's president says France and Germany have the opportunity to be game changers by delivering more weapons, including warplanes, to Kiev to help it fight with Russia.
The sooner we get heavy long-range weapons and our pilots get modern planes, Emmanuel, the earlier our pilots can get modern planes, Olaf, the more powerful will be our tank coalition. And I'm thankful to you for starting this path. The quicker this Russian aggression will end and we return Europe to a certain peace.
Zelensky also said that he intends to strengthen continental unity. He arrived in Paris for dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in a joint press conference after the meeting. Macron said Ukraine can count on France and its European partners to win the war against Russia.
Ukraine can count on France, its European partners, and its allies to win the war. Russia cannot and must not win. As long as it will attack, it will be necessary that we continue and adapt the military support vital to preserving Ukraine and its future. In the same way that we've gone ahead with new military equipment deliveries over the last few weeks, we will continue our work. Tonight we will talk together about the operational needs of Ukraine.
Macron added that Ukraine's Western allies want to lead the peace-building process alongside Kiev as an indispensable complement to the war. Meanwhile, the German Chancellor said Russia must not win the war. Earlier, Zelensky visited London, where he urged the British Prime Minister and other Western governments to send fighter jets to Ukraine. However, Russia has warned the UK against any such move, saying that it will have serious military and political consequences for the entire world. Western countries have scaled up their pledges of military aid for Ukraine this year. They've already announced their plans to equip Kiev with hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles, as well as longer-range missiles, but have so far refused to deliver warplanes. Well, joining us on this edition of the News Review, from St. Petersburg, we have journalist and podcaster Esha Krishnaswamy and Mr. Glenn Diesen, Professor of Political Science, University of Southeastern Norway, is joining us from Oslo. Welcome to the program. Let's start off with Ms. Krishnaswamy in St. Petersburg. Kiev is calling now for France and Germany to be game changers in the war. They also want fighter jets now to be delivered. To give us your assessment of the request by the Ukrainian president.
Well, I have a lot to say because in between November and December, I went to Lugansk, which is an area that has been under bombardment by Kiev since 2014. So the first comment I'd like to make is regarding the issue of aggression, because in 2014, what happened was that the areas of Lugansk and Donetsk in the beginning did not want independence. And only after Kiev began the ATO operations, or anti-terrorist operations, did they start fighting for independence. So that's the first comment. As for France and Germany delivering planes, military planes to Ukraine, the irony is that back in the 1980s, Ukraine used to make its own military planes, and it shows you how much the Western influence has deindustrialized Ukraine, that they need weapons from France and Germany. But this is clearly an escalatory measure because for now, it has been a war between Russia and Ukraine. And the more the West gets involved, the more likely it is going to be a war between many countries in the West and Russia. And these, any military equipment is not just, you just drop off the military equipment. No, what happens is that trainers from the countries come and train the people who need to use it on how to use it, how to organize it. And so with the delivery of equipment comes more and more involvement of the West, which is dangerous because, of course, we know Russia is a nuclear power, UK is a nuclear power, US is a nuclear power, and it is a very, very dangerous tinderbox that they're starting, in my opinion.
Glenn Diesen, your thoughts on the issue as well. Kiev is now asking some European countries to include warplanes in their military assistance. Talk to us about that request and also about Russia's warning with regards to having, if that happens and if this military support continues, there'll be consequences for the entire world. What does that mean?
Well, I think it's a comment directed also specifically towards the British, because they've had a very central role in escalating this conflict. Britain was very supportive not only of the coup in 2014, but we see that the British was quite central in militarizing Ukraine into a NATO fortress. For example, in 2021, Ukraine confirmed that the UK would fund the construction of naval bases on Ukraine's Black Sea that could host NATO warships. The British were previously sailing warships in what Russia considers to be its territorial waters. So they were already provoking long before the Russian invasion. After the Russian invasion, before the Russian invasion, we also saw that the British were very central in sabotaging the Minsk peace agreement for 7 years. Thereafter, after the Russians invaded, Israeli negotiators have now, or previous prime minister have confirmed that Britain was quite central in trying to sabotage, or did sabotage, their efforts to establish a ceasefire because they wanted instead a war with Russia. The Turkish have said the same thing. The foreign minister, he argued that NATO, well, especially at the front, would be Britain, also sabotage their peace efforts after the Israelis, because they also said the British wanted to use Ukrainians to fight Russians. Even the German General Kuyat, who was also the former chairman of the NATO Military Committee, has also said that Boris Johnson and the UK was quite central in sabotaging any efforts of establishing a peace, because they wanted to fight Russia with Ukrainians. And this is something that Boris Johnson also very openly wrote and spoke about, that he didn't want a bad peace. He said the only acceptable outcome would be Russian loss on the battlefield. So this follows the British logic. It's only heavier and heavier weapons, and of course also hoping that the rest of the NATO countries will follow, because if the British would supply fighter jets, then the argument would be that, well, perhaps now they lower the bar, the French would join as well, the Germans. So they're kind of trying to take the lead in escalating this war, where effectively they would like to fight Russia until the last Ukrainian, which also many of their American counterparts have said very openly as well. So it's I think this is why the Russians are now putting this warning out very specifically to the British, because they've had such a central role with the Americans in terms of avoiding any peace for the past 9 years, and instead always attempting to escalate this into a war.
Mr. Deason, I'm going to stay with you. By many accounts, the premise here is that Europe is basically dancing to the beat of the United States here. So the question is, what is the end game for Europe here? What does a winning scenario look like for European countries?
Well, initially the hope was that Russia could be defeated militarily, the sanctions would crush its economy, Russia would be isolated in the world, and you would have regime change in Moscow. Again, the Americans and British are quite open about what they would like to have seen happen. Of course, this is quite problematic now, because no countries outside NATO really wants to support either the supply of weapon or sanctions. And Russia is also seemingly prevailing now on the battlefield. So this creates a big problem for NATO, because in NATO we don't want to lose this war. We made this very clear. So we're at this very difficult point, because either now Russia will win or we have to escalate. So either we have to strike a peace now, or again, more heavy weapons. So it appears that we're going for the heavy weapons instead. It's just that the problem is a lot of our weapon storages have been depleted, and any heavier weapon now it removes any pretense that this is simply a Ukrainian-Russian war, because again the Ukrainians are fighting with with our weapon, using our intelligence, and it's becoming very obvious that this is now a direct war between NATO and Russia, and at some point I think Russia will have to strike back at NATO, because they can't allow this to continue. Now, I don't think that would happen in terms of direct attack, but evidently the goal of the British, and I think wider NATO, is simply to bleed Russia as much as possible.
Mr. Krishnaswamy, let's talk about the Russian response to that. Russia has alluded to the military and political consequences, for serious military and political consequences for the entire world. Give us your perspective on the Russian response, and also talking about Europe. How much is Europe basically losing here as opposed to the United States? We already know that European citizens, they aren't too happy given the financial difficulties that they're facing, that their governments are basically using up a lot of capital to support this war.
So Europe is losing in many different ways. Primarily in Germany, a lot of factories and industries have either slowed down or shut down, and that's hurt the economy very much. And also, Europe used to rely on a large supply of Russian gas into the country for many uses, both industrial and domestic. And unfortunately, that has been cut off. And so Europe has been hit much harder than the United States. As for the Russian response, so far, we all know that there are big supplies from Poland coming into Russia, and coming into the war in Ukraine. And Russia has avoided directly hitting any of these supply lines inside of Poland. And today, the Polish foreign minister announced that Poland is going to be training 2 army battalions in Ukraine. And so it could mean that Russia will be less hesitant to attack these weapons caches and repair facilities in Poland if Poland's involvement gets more and more direct in the war situation.
All right, thanks a lot. We're going to leave it there. Journalist and podcaster Esha Krishnaswamy joining us from St. Petersburg. And thanks to Professor Glenn Deason joining us from Oslo. What that brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review, but stick around, there's plenty more to come here on Press TV.